weekend?
This is good. This is busy. I have a fun little like nerd thing to tell you. So after we had that like discussion on Dorothy Lang and like the whole Tokerville thing, I
Right.
went up north to see my family and I was just like talking to my uncle and she came up in conversation and apparently he has and he like started nerding out about her and like that whole thing and he has the original like times issue from the whatever, like the Mormon
Oh yeah,
towns, that
the
thing.
Time magazine with a lot of those photos.
hmm
Right. Yeah,
Yeah, and it was really cool to look through it. So,
that is very cool.
mhm.
Well, I'm glad you have experiences like that, and I'm glad that you're courageous enough to just work in the odd things like Dorothea Lange into
Yeah,
random conversations. That's great.
that was funny.
Takes a certain amount of bravery. All right. Now, this week we're going to talk about basically the 1960s, and then next we're going to talk about 70s to about halfway through the 80s, and then the last week we're going to talk about mid 80s all to the end, way to the end of the century. So you'll notice that I took off the last two modules. I closed them so nobody can look at them. I've just finished grading, and I am pretty sure that nobody has submitted. Yeah, it looks like nobody's submitted anything for those last modules. So nobody has to redo any work, which is excellent. And I wanted to talk about a couple things today, just for everybody in the class. One is everything that I have that has been turned into now has been graded. And if you got a 0 and you turned something in, or you got less than what you expected, there's a couple things that are going on. One is actually, honestly, the most common is people submit like the wrong thing to the wrong item. Like I've had several people submit weekly reflections to projects, and the other way around. So that's the most common. But a lot of the times when a lot of the times when it's a 0, it'll be like the wrong assignment. Uh, for weekly reflections, it may be a week earlier or later than what the assignment calls for, or a weekly reflection submitted for attendance, or the other way around. So all those things happen quite a bit. So double check that you sent the right thing in. Another really common one is again with citations. Uh, Citations need to be in. Sarah, do you remember the format?
Emily.
MLA. That's right. That's the format that we use. And if you go to the very first how to do your projects kind of page, I give 10 different websites that you guys can use for free that will help you just submit it, put in the website or the URL that you're referencing, and it will generate a MLA format citation. When you do that, double check that it's on MLA and not ADA. And that there's several of the websites give you like 17 different options. Make sure it's MLA citation option. Then if it looks funky, like sometimes, since it's usually AI generated, and for example, say the person who wrote the article is Dr. Lisa Armstrong, what it will do a lot of the times is have show doctor. It will treat doctor as a first name, which it's not. Usually, in cases like that, you do last name, then doctor, and first name. And there's just different funny things like that. Sometimes, if there's not a specific author, it will have an abbreviation of some sort. And before you copy and paste it into your submission, double check and make sure that it looks right. Because about 1 out of every 20 times it screws up and it's kind of weird. Another thing that's common is alphabetizing and remembering to put the accessed on phrase at the end of every citation. So you do your citation, you end it with a period, and then you write accessed on and the date that you referenced it or that you used it. And that's pretty much all you've got to do. The next most common, and those are by far most common. Next things are when people forget to submit everything in the project. Like, for example, writing the long essay, you need to have 8 images in it. And if you forget all the images, then you lose the points for that. Just go back through, edit in the images. I insert images that are no bigger than about 2 inches in relation to an 8.5 by 11 page, and put them in, insert them as close as you can to where you're writing about them. Just do the best you can with that. And sometimes you can wrap the words around it. Sometimes it doesn't want to do that. It's fine. If that's the case, just insert the image as close as you can to where you're writing about it, and then just continue on with the paper. But if you remember to make it about 2 inches or smaller, 1.5 inches to 2 inches, right around there, then that will do the trick. And then something that's happening every once in a while, but not as often, is somebody will submit a project that just is not consistent with this class. Now, there's been a lot of creative stuff. People have done cooking projects and things like that, and that's awesome. When you do that, you need to submit it with something that shows how it's related to 20th century art. And like, if you wanted to, you could submit a recipe for pot roast from the 1950s, because you see that in the painting Nighthawks by Edward Hopper. And that would be totally legit because you're showing the painting, you're connecting it to that. And then for your citation, you would cite that painting, Nighthawks, and you would cite the recipe. Does this make all sense for you? And if you want to do something and you know that it should be connected, but you don't know exactly how to articulate that, get a hold of me, and we can usually figure out a way to get it so that it feels articulated with a certain amount of rationality, that it feels plausible. Submitting a project about ancient Greek sculpture for 20th century art really isn't going to do it unless you can demonstrate that some of these, like Harlem Renaissance sculptors were using classical Roman and Greek sculpture as their basis, and then you can tie it in with that, and then make your own thing. In some cases, people have tried to tie it in, but what they did in their project doesn't entirely fit with the movement that they're relating to it to. So I've said, well, if you tie it into this movement instead, that's a better fit, and then we're good. So, and remember too that you guys can keep resubmitting right up until the bitter end of the class. Now, I think we talked about maybe we didn't. Did we talk about last day of class? Because I believe we have 2 more Tuesdays. And I'm going to do a 90-minute thing for each of those Tuesdays. But if anybody has any questions that they would like to see me answer about any of the projects or anything like that, please feel free to email me or text me, and I will work that into the online Teams lecture. The last thing I wanted to mention was proposals for your final capstone project. That needs to be in the form of the emails back and forth up until the point that I say, great, go for it. And the reason why that's important is so that the school has a record of what I have committed to you doing. So if at the end, you do that and I say, oh, this doesn't count, you can say, well, actually, I did exactly what these emails said, and the school has a record of it, so you've got to give me credit. Conversely, it also prevents you from submitting work that doesn't count because we've already gone through the approval process and we know exactly what you're going to be doing. And I don't want anybody wasting their time, pouring hours into something that doesn't count for this class or isn't a viable project because we didn't go through that approval process. So it was due on Sunday. Please, everybody, do it as rapidly and quickly as you can. Every time I see the emails, I respond to them. And already back today, I've responded to about 3 or 4 people. So we have 5 more that have been submitted, but we still need everybody else in the rest of the class. So Sarah, I hope you're not embarrassed. I'm going to ask you, did you already submit yours?
Yeah.
All right. Now there were about 3 people that submitted something that said we emailed back and forth or things like that, or the first lines of emails. What we actually need is the email, enough of the email so that we know what your project is. And my phrase, great, go for it. Or yes, go on, let's do it. All right, does that make sense? Okay. And if you're one of those few where you get a 0 even though you submitted, look and see what I said, because it may be that the right image didn't come through. Sometimes it happens on Canvas. All righty. Okay, I'm going to do a screen share now. And we're going to show you, before we do that, Sarah, do you have any questions? Or can you think of any questions other people might have?
I mean, I don't know about questions other people would have. I don't know. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but
All
maybe
right.
people pop in later.
Did you do the prints on the wall behind you?
No, my sister got them for me,
Oh,
but
okay.
I'll pretend that I did.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. You're going through your red and blue phases.
Oh yeah, it's a Mondrian in me.
All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you my view of this module. And this is what we're going to talk about today. It does look a little bit different than it did a week ago, because like I told you, I'm going to go through and this one and this one I have to finish, and I will finish those in the next week. So it's more comprehensive, because we have been really working hard at the first 60 years of this century, of the 20th century. And the classes for all of the 20th century. So the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the stuff that leads into the contemporary art and the 21st century. Now, if you remember, what we're going to be talking about is about 1960 to about 1970, right around there. And a lot of things happened in the 20 years leading up to 1960. We've had World War II, which at the end of it, it was successful in breaking most of the world free of the Depression. Then in the areas where the fighting actually happened during World War II, they had a really difficult time of it. While the US was enjoying a lot of prosperity, Great Britain was still experiencing a lot of rationing, which was very difficult for a lot of people. But some other issues that a lot of people don't talk about is we have several satellite wars. A satellite war is a war that happens not connected with a principal big headline war. And some of these satellite wars, even though hundreds, if not thousands of people get killed, include things like the Korean War, and later during the 60s and 70s, the Vietnam War, Desert Shield, in the 90s. We have several people going to the Middle East. Then also all the peacekeeping missions labeled that by UN forces around the world. All those are called satellite wars. And those really started picking up after World War II. And Sarah, do you remember why all those things started picking up?
I mean,
There's
I think
actually
there were a
two
lot of
principal reasons. I'm sorry?
what? Oh, sorry. What did you say after that?
I was saying that there are actually two principal reasons, but we only talked about one of them.
Mm, I don't know. I guess like at least one of them is that there were a lot of loose ends after World War II that I think like caused problems like just in like the decade or two after. But then I don't know, like just all the Cold War stuff going on at the same time. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And with the with different governments around the world being involved unofficially in Cold War hotspots, you get a lot of satellite wars going on everywhere. And things that today we honestly cannot see how the people who organized them could ever rationalize what was happening. I mean, it's difficult to understand what they were thinking. And I think um, a lot of that kind of stuff we don't get the full picture. And I'll share an example. This happened during World War II. Winston Churchill, one of the things that he pushed for really hard was breaking the Enigma machine that the Germans had built with computer technology from the late 1930s with revolving codes that it wasn't until Dr. Turing came along mid World War II where the British was finally able to break it. And what was so heartbreaking about that situation is in order to end the war, Winston Churchill and the leadership of Great Britain realized that they could not allow anything to get out that they had broke about breaking the code. And so when they got a code across that where the Germans were planning the bombing of Coventry in England, which would mean the loss of tens of thousands of lives, Winston Churchill said he had to weigh that against the millions of lives that would be saved by ending the war. And it was the worst decision, one of the worst decisions he ever made. He did something similar with money going or food going to different fronts, and he had to pick out which front to send the food to. Which one was most important, which meant that several soldiers actually starved to death, and just making decisions like that, it's really heartbreaking. And I don't think we'll ever really understand that kind of stuff until much later. But yeah, you're right. The second issue, so Cold War, and then another thing that's happening after World War II, when people saw uh, the Allies sweep across and liberate a lot of Europe from the hold of the Nazis, it inspired several societies to throw off the shackles of what they viewed as a repressive government regimes, just like what happened after the American War for Independence, when France and Bolivia and several other countries declared independence. Something similar happened after World War II, and a lot of countries, a lot of groups of people uh, fought against colonialism because there were still vestiges of colonialism throughout the world. And so those two things are really dealing with the stresses that are contributing to the stresses that people are encountering. And of course, when you get a hot spot, men go out to fight, women get the jobs that they left behind, and that causes a lot of frustration when the men come back and everybody assumes, oh, they're going to have their jobs back, even though the women have already been trained and proved that they know how to do it. And then you also have in World War II, in several countries, the idea of racism was not nearly as big as it was in the US. And you get several groups of soldiers, and I'm thinking particularly Black Americans and Japanese Americans and Indigenous Americans coming back from the war where they were respected as individuals. And when they come home, they don't have an identity anymore. People ignore a lot of these folks. I remember watching a show that took place in Australia where white soldiers and Aboriginal soldiers were brothers on the battlefield and they saved each other's lives countless times. But when they got back home to Australia, the white soldiers would have to sneak drinks and food out from the officers' club to their Aboriginal friends because they weren't allowed in, even though they had saved each other's lives countless times. And so a lot of these kinds of stresses. So we're dealing with social stresses, identity, and I want you guys to watch both of these videos. And I think, let's see, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to see how long this video is after we skip the ad. Because if it's short, that might be good to watch. Let's see how. Well, this is about 6 minutes. What this video does is talk specifically about African Americans post World War II, going through this era of unprecedented economic prosperity in the U.S. And I think, I don't know, would you be surprised to find out that even Native Americans didn't have the vote until 1938? Did you know that?
I mean, yeah, and I mean it's not shocking because
Well, and then Chinese Americans could not even apply for citizenship until I believe it was 1942.
yeah.
And then this 1950s talks about women in the workforce. With this economic prosperity comes a lot of other things, and part of that is women realizing that they can actually express their voice and start to take more and more of a role in the voting environment, the political environment, and the workforce environment. So watch both of these. I think they're both really good videos that kind of touch on that. And this one is a series of little skits that where one actor portrays a particularly obnoxious pig. And his boss just educates him in a very hand petting on the head kind of way about women in the workforce. But I think it's kind of funny. This one is a little bit humorous, but they're dealing with issues that are heartbreakingly real, and we still deal with today. It's reverberated down the ages. Things are a lot better today for the most part, but there's still a lot of issues where we do need to be mindful and aware and considerate still. And I think that that's something that we'll always need to do just as human beings, be mindful, aware, and considerate. And in the art world, we're just getting over things like regionalism, and then people really pushing the boundaries of non-objective abstraction. We get color field, we get abstract expressionism. And when you couple the idea of art and the art world with just preposterous prosperity in the Americas, what you get is artists that are, of course, trying to connect the two. And what is really interesting to me is that these movements that we're going to talk about deal with some very similar things. Just like abstract expressionism, you have, and color field art both deal with the same issues. Different people will do it differently. And people coming from different groups in different areas in the world will deal with similar issues in the same way. And a lot of that comes from what side of which issue you're on. Where are you in relationship to the society that has the issue? Whatever that issue is. And I think it's really fascinating. But that's what we're going to be talking about. And a lot of these things are going to come down to essentially expression and cultural critique. Now, I want to be really clear as we move on. There are some things that I really, really enjoy just because I love the fact that the person has remarkable new ideas that people didn't have before. And sometimes the stuff that I really enjoy, I don't agree with necessarily. I don't agree with the rationale behind it. And that doesn't matter. I can still appreciate the art. If somebody is singing, and I'm particularly thinking about Italian opera because that's sometimes where my brain goes. And they're doing this absolutely beautiful song, and then you find out that this lady actually represents the bride of Satan, and she's totally, truly evil. But the song is still beautiful. I love the song. I love the music, but I'm not espousing her ultimately destructive worldview. I'm speaking specifically of the Night Queen's aria from the Magic Flute. One of the most difficult and beautiful songs to sing. But you know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yeah, that's like the exact one that like popped into my brain when you said that.
Okay. That is so funny. So we can appreciate what people do. and we can appreciate the thinking and daring behind it, even if we don't agree with it. You know, when I talk about how grateful I am for the art that came out of the Harlem Renaissance and how that is some of the most beautiful stuff still that will always exist in the world, I am in absolutely no way encouraging or supporting any of the effects that led to the Great Migration that was a direct contributor to the Harlem Renaissance. You know, I love the artwork. It makes me sick to think about what happened to those people to put them there. So anyway, so I just want to make that clear for everybody. And I'm glad you got that. And it's kind of weird that you would think of the exact same thing.
Yeah. I definitely grew up on that opera. Like that's what we listened to every night. So
well, and Papageno, oh, such the most thoughtless, misogynistic pig I've ever seen.
True.
I still love those, like the duets and stuff he was in.
They're so fun.
Just horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what I wanted to have you guys also watch these. I think the longest one is maybe 6 or 7 minutes, but it also talks about the rapidly changing culture. Now, you probably don't. Many people hope in Utah Tech know more than other people, but the first television was invented by a Utah inventor, and his great niece is actually a photography student at Utah Tech, which I think is pretty cool. And Milo Farnsworth, if you've ever, I don't know if you've heard of that name, but when you have, this is an economic era when a typical professional person's salary, and we're not even talking higher level, we're talking about absolute mid-level, but we're also talking about the salary of somebody who is an on-call repairman. We're talking about the salary of somebody who is a manager at a gas station. This was enough. 2.5 years of that kind of salary would buy you a house. And you had the means to support your family and give them a lot of fun stuff. And you didn't have to work 90 hours a week. And it just dramatically changed how people started living their lives. And when color TV came on, then, you know, the days of playing outside were not quite ruined forever. But I think, you know, you could hear the bell tolling for that. So you get unprecedented prosperity and absolutely new ways of wasting away slack time, essentially. And then this one talks about the timeline of the 60s. And I kind of like that. This is mostly in the US. A lot of other stuff happened. Remember, one of those factors we were talking about was colonialism around the world was starting to lose its grip. Were you aware that the last colony governed by Europe was the French actually retreated from it and gave it up about 2.5 years ago? Did you know that?
Really? I
Yeah.
did not know that.
Because I thought it was all over in the 50s and 60s, but it wasn't.
Dang.
You know,
What
and
colony was it?
It was. I can't remember. I want to say Mauritania, but that is going to be totally wrong. But let me look up really quick because I bet I can find it. Okay, it does talk about French Djibouti, which was given up in 1977, but the date that I had was 1920 or 2022 was when the very last colony of France was liberated, and it was something. And I remember seeing an article about that. I'll have to do some more research and share it with you guys. But I thought that was really, really interesting. And all this, of course, does contribute to the art world. You know, what's going on in the 60s? We have Malcolm X, who he was a thug and a car thief until he found religion in prison. And he became a devout Muslim and a person with just fearsome integrity. And, you know, him and Martin Luther King and other people became just, a lot of them became friends with JFK, and a lot of legislation was passed to repair a lot of the damage that had been continuing after the Civil War. And what's interesting about that is that there is some speculation, and I don't know how true it is, but there is some speculation that a lot of the problems that were going on socially in the 1960s were to distract people from the very real issues of integration and desegregation. So I just think that that's really interesting. But it was a time when people actually did have some energy and time to spend on more important issues than just surviving. And some of those more important issues than just surviving is, I believe, and this is, opinion and observation, but just being able to get along with people and treating people with egalitarianism. And then this is another little bit on the 60s that I think is worthwhile. Now, I want to watch this with you. I think that this is great. This one deals with quite a bit of the, as soon as the ad is over, we'll watch it. But what I love about this is, there is civil strife. There are these satellite wars going on. But what I really like is this kind of shows a retrofuturistic perspective on the hope that people had for the future. It's only about 4.5 minutes long, but I think that both these things coupled together, kind of, the idea of all the strifes around the world and social problems, and then this kind of hopefulness, I think both of these contribute to these art movements we look at, and I think that you'll see as we move forward.
1999 AD. More than a generation away, and yet dreams travel faster than light. And even now, scientists and planners are shaping the lives of our children who will live in the 21st century. How will they live? Perhaps in a honeycombed structure like this. Hexagon modules that grow with a family's size and interests. All pertinent information about this family, its records, its tastes and reference material, is stored in the central home computer, which is secretary, librarian, banker, teacher, medical technician, bridge partner, and all-around servant in this house of tomorrow. Master James Shaw, 8 years old, student. His assignments are programmed into the home computer and fed into teaching machines, which allow him to progress as rapidly as his awakening mind can absorb the audio-visual lessons. In the same way, Jamie, although he has a rigorous lesson schedule, is already taking advantage of his electronic world.
Hey, Mom, I'm hungry.
Yeah, me too. How about lunch?
How about 2 minutes?
Okay, 2 minutes and counting. 120, 119.
All right.
At the turn of the next century, most food will be stored frozen in individual portions. The computer will keep a running inventory on all foodstuffs and suggest daily menus based on the nutritional needs of the family. When the meal has been selected, the various portions are fed automatically into the microwave oven for a few seconds of thawing or warming.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3,
2, 1.
And luncheon is served.
Split-second lunches, color-keyed disposable dishes, all part of the instant society of tomorrow. Fingertip shopping will be one of the many homemakers' conveniences. This video console will be channeled into the store of her choice. There, a camera will scan a display of wares, which she will select by push button. What the wife selects on her console will be paid for by the husband at his counterpart console. All bills and transactions will be carried out electronically. A central bank computer will debit the family's account the amount of purchases and credit the department store, for example, informing the family's home computer at the same time. Father, at the touch of a button, receives an instantaneous printed copy of his budget, the amount of taxes he owes, the payments left on the car, and so forth. Also at his disposal is an electronic correspondence machine, or home post office, which allows for instant written communication between individuals anywhere in the world. What's next? The things you've seen are technically possible. It remains only to apply what we now know to fulfill these dreams of tomorrow. The world of 1999 and beyond is limited only by the boundaries of our imagination today.
Isn't that interesting? That was a film in 1967.
I feel like I'm used to seeing those that are like really outrageous. Like that one picture of like, I don't know, people walking across a lake with like hot air balloons on their backs. Like usually they're crazy, but that one, it was interesting to see how like we're actually seeing some of that.
Another thing I liked about it is that the design sense was very much mid-century modern, and we're going to be looking at that a little bit later too. But I think it's kind of funny. I don't know if funny is the right word, but it is at the very least very interesting, where you do have this kind of hopeful optimism for the future. You know, if only every child was irritated because he missed a couple lessons about Copernicus, and that was the biggest worry that he had. You know,
yeah.
And it's some of the things I think were eerily dead on, but some of the other things I thought were kind of funny, like why did the dad and the son just assume that the mom would be the only one making the food? How come she's the only one who? And I remember growing up in my home, you know, I told my mom I was hungry, and she'd say, "Okay, make yourself something." You know.
Yep.
I just there's some things I think I like that I think that are really interesting. Now, some of the art period movements that we're going to talk about are things. Most of them are stuff that we are very aware of today without even realizing how much they still impact us. And what I have is this is by no way definitive. I have 4 different artists, and hopefully everybody knows about Andy Warhol, but I wanted to introduce you guys to some others as well. And these guys are known as pop artists. And I want to watch, these are 2 short videos that talk about what pop art is. And what do you think the word pop from pop art comes from?
I mean, I know that like in other contexts it comes from like popular.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly it. And one of the things that inspired a lot of these artists is the fact that there are some very real issues that people are dealing with globally, but Americans seem to be, particularly Americans, but America still remains the single most powerful international buying power in the world. And what's interesting is several of the artists of this time period were looking at things like how much marketing was engaging people. You know, how, like we spoke last week, I believe, a little bit about how after World War II, this is when we start seeing cosmetic companies targeting women, telling them they're no longer beautiful, even though they had been before then. Now they're no longer beautiful. All of a sudden, they can only be beautiful with the cosmetics that the cosmetic companies are selling. And the time period before World War II, some people did wear makeup, like people that were high society celebrities, and it became more and more popular as movies became more and more popular. Like makeup for the silent black and white films was limited to basically light and dark colors because that's all anybody could see. And the as cinematography and photography both increased technologically and did different things technologically, that's when people marketers found that they could be a little bit more precise in their targeting of individuals. And and you see that the growth of technological advances in cinematography reflected in the capacities for marketing, and then also the availability for things like cosmetics and stuff. And I just think that's interesting how all that stuff kind of comes together. But in and amongst all that, Americans are becoming a lot more at ease with the idea that to be happy means to have possessions. And it's this kind of idea of consumerism is not an American only thing by any means. You get if you are you familiar at all with like internet marketing? In internet
Only
marketing,
at a very basic level.
okay. In internet marketing, there's 3-tier levels for targeting marketing. Tier 1 are English-speaking democratic countries, and that is important because the English-speaking democratic countries are the most powerful economic units in the world. The United States is right at the top, but you have Canada, UK, and Australia are incredibly powerful. And that's where a lot of this marketing goes to. And it's interesting to me that the pop artists were the one, for the most part, are ones that are coming from these societies. That doesn't surprise me at all. They're in every society, of course, but the ones that became most rapidly well known are the ones that were from what internet marketing refers to as top tier or tier 1 countries. And top tier is not a judgment on the values of the country. It's just an evaluation of the economic power, the disposable income of the country. So, but so I want to watch both of these. Neither of them are very long, and then we'll talk about them. But you're right. Pop art refers to popular because that's what they're doing. It's a direct critique of rampant commercialism and consumerism.
So this brings us to pop art. Pop art is ultimately a reaction to abstract expressionism. They are trying to create something concrete, something that is approachable, while frequently incorporating many of the same ideas that we will see from abstract expressionism and elsewhere. So let's get into a bit of a definition. First of all, following the popularity of abstract expressionists, pop art will try and reintroduce identifiable imagery drawn from mass media and popular culture. And this will be a major shift for the direction of modern art or modernism. The subject matter became far from traditional high art themes of morality, mythology, and classical history. Rather, pop artists celebrated commonplace objects and the people of everyday life, in this way seeking to elevate popular culture to the level of fine art. Perhaps owing to the incorporation of commercial imagery, pop art has become one of the most recognizable art forms that we will see. In the years following World War II, the United States actually enjoys an unprecedented period of economic growth, and we see people moving to the suburbs, spurred by the availability of inexpensive, mass-produced homes. Now, this is the start of the problem for pop art. When you look at this, We are entering into a consumer-driven culture where everything is mass-produced, from the houses and lots down to the things that you buy to decorate them. And as pop art sees it, that mass production will speak to the people, and arguably they're right. And you have to understand the time period. That 10-year period from 1945 to 55, following World War II, we see household incomes triple. So suddenly everything becomes a lot cheaper, because imagine if your household income tripled over 10 years. What you used to struggle for suddenly is like paying nothing. That $200 car payment, for example, becomes like paying $20. Who cares? You don't even budget it. You just sort of sit there and go, yep, it's going to come out and I'm good, so I don't have to worry about it. So you see where pop art is kind of jumping in and saying, hey, we can speak to this group, to this new middle class, through the language that they are most familiar with, which is that of mass consumption and mass production. Now, Elvis Presley led the emergence of rock and roll. Marilyn Monroe will reign as a film star, and television, of course, replaces radio as the dominant media outlet. Yet, by the late 1950s and early 1960s, we see a cultural revolution, which is underway, led by activists, thinkers, and artists who sought to rethink and even overturn what was, in their eyes, a stifling social order ruled by conformity. And of course, this will impact the art world as well. We see the Vietnam War inciting mass protests. We see the civil rights movement seeking equality for African Americans, and the women's liberation movement will gain momentum. But ultimately, pop art will be inspired by the everyday. And it was in this climate of turbulence, experimentation, and consumerism that a new generation of artists emerged in Britain and America in the mid to late 1950s. Pop artists began to look for inspiration in the world around them, representing and at times making art directly from everyday items, consumer goods, and mass media. They even adopt commercial methods like silk screening, or produced multiples of works, downplaying the artist and subverting the idea of originality, playing off that Dada idea that we dealt with weeks ago, where the original can be one of six. There isn't really an original. And this is in marked contrast with the highly expressive, large-scale abstract works of the abstract expressionists, whose work had dominated post-war America, but who pop art felt had alienated many of its viewers. So pop artists will favor realism, everyday and oftentimes even mundane imagery, and heavy doses of irony and wit. Yet we have pop artists like Warhol and Lichtenstein who are very aware of the past. They sought to connect fine art traditions with pop culture elements from television, advertisement, film, and cartoons. At the same time, their work will challenge traditional boundaries between media, combining painted gestures with photography and printmaking. So, let's look at pop art.
Yeah, I'm going to switch to this one too, because this one is the second part of that same video that we just saw. It's very short.
The origins. Now, pop art was born in Britain in the mid-1950s and was the brainchild of several young subversive artists, as most modern art tends to be. The first application of the term pop art actually occurs during discussions among artists who call themselves the Independent Group, which was part of the Institute of Contemporary Art in London around 1952. The movement was officially christened by Lawrence Alloway in his article, The Arts and Mass Media. Art history textbooks tend to claim that Richard Hamilton was sort of the original pop artist. He signals pop art's arrival on the scene with his collage work. Pop art, however, for the most part, completed the modernist movement in the early 1970s with its optimistic investment in contemporary subject matter. It also ended the modernism movement by holding up a mirror to contemporary society. Once we see the postmodernist generation looking hard and long into the mirror, self-doubt took over and the party atmosphere of pop art will fade away. So it's really sort of grabbing on to the end of modernism, showing it a mirror, showing it how foolish it really is, or at least in their mind, how foolish it really is. And then as soon as we have postmodernism, which kind of holds a mirror to pop art, that will create an end to the pop art movement.
All right, now this is also a really good video to watch too, but I'm not going to show this one. When we talk about pop art, there are a couple things that I think are consistent, regardless of the visual style. Labeling it as pop art, there are a couple of things that are pretty consistent. Do you remember some of just a couple of the things that he talked about? Like, for example, what kind of imagery are the artists going to be interested in?
Ew. That was a part of it that I was like not paying as much attention to as taking notes.
I'll ask it in a different way. Was it, if we go 200 years earlier, what kind of imagery do people have in their oil paintings?
I mean, it's all going to be like realistic, like realism.
Yeah, it's going to be historical. It's going to be biblical. It's going to be scenes that people see in normal daily life. Those kinds of things. And what kind of media are people going to be using? They're going to be using the media that they think will last a long time, particularly oil paints. Oil paints that were used were actually invented, I believe, in about they started being used right towards the end of the Crusades, but oil paints didn't really become super popular for painters until after the Renaissance started. And people used tempera and things like that beforehand, but oil paints became like the important thing. And so people were portraying important events with important media. And then how do those two things change when we go into pop art? Are they those important earth-shattering or earth-building events anymore that are being portrayed?
Not really. It's just kind of like what you see every day.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I like that last collage where it's like, it kind of just looks like a regular living room, obviously like with not regular people, but.
Yeah. It's imagery that comes out of magazines that were thrown away. That's why Andy Warhol did soup cans, is what he's famous for, or extracting images from movie posters. You get Roy Lichtenstein, who did comic books, or Sunday comics kind of imagery. And then the media that people are going to be using, instead of things like oil paint or tempera, they are using things like silkscreen or spray paint, just everyday ordinary stuff. And I think that that's really interesting. And they're going back to imagery that is easily recognizable for a broad spectrum of humanity, not because it's important to be realistic, but the vital element is that it's accessible. And so, it's a soup can that looks like a soup can that's even labeled a soup can. And the formatting was very intentional. They're still following formatting that was developed during the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, the placement of figures and things like that. But it's interesting that the subject matter is so vastly different. This is stuff you find at a supermarket or in a magazine. Now, Edward Palozzi is one of the pop artists that is considered to be like the fairy godfather of pop art. And I want to show you some of his stuff, and we're just going to look at these guys really quick. As you look at them, or as you go through the module, I would like you to, each of the videos are anywhere from 1.5 minutes to 5.5 minutes. So watch those. For each of the artists that I named, there's a video and a magazine well, not a magazine article, an internet article that talks about their work. So this is Eduardo's work, and you can see it's essentially a silk screen. You know, this one right here is a silk screen with imagery that feels like it's accessible. This looks very much like a radio. And then here's a wallpaper design. Here's several different colors, but it looks like there's references to some of the other artwork that was really popular at the time. Some of these elements were very, very popular in clothing, in fabric in textile patterns. And but he did some really fascinating stuff. Like this kind of reminds me a little bit of, I don't know if you've ever seen the original animated movie, The Beatles' Yellow Submarine. It's very psychedelic.
Mm-hmm.
It was called psychedelic pop art, is what it's based on. You know, and he gets these images that are derived directly from photographs that are printed over and over again, or images that are like this painting. It looks like you'd see it in a magazine, except it's silkscreen and not printed on a printing press. So he did some really interesting things, but you can kind of see where this would start emerging into what we become more familiar with as pop art. And of course, the Men in Black celebrity, Andy Warhol. And there's a lot of stuff about him in the media and different things where he's kind of ridiculed by a lot of people because they thought he was a shallow thinker. But I was able to visit with somebody, one of his proteges. At the time that she was working with him, her name was Ultraviolet. And then she became an evangelical Christian. Really an interesting woman. And she has a very different take on him. But he would tell the media, well, I do the things I do because it's easier. When in private conversations, he would say, yeah, I'm really concerned about rampant consumerism. And I want people to realize that all this stuff is just stuff. And hopefully they'll come to their senses and realize when I make these huge paintings that are lithographs of soup cans, you know, I'm not celebrating the consumer product. And just, you know, really, he was a very interesting guy, for sure. But definitely, and the video that's associated with that has some really good images. And this is 8 minutes. Rosalind Drexler is another pop artist. And I only have 4 people, but I tried to bring a pretty good spectrum of different people. And some of this work, I think, is really interesting because it reminds me, particularly the very graphic simplification of the human figure. It reminds me of, what's his name? The guy that we did Harlem Renaissance, who really likes these huge graphic images, graphic style images, not graphic, but he did for the Houston World's Fair. He did those huge, big paintings that looked like silk screens with primarily purple and green. Do you know who I'm talking about? Right out of the Harlem
In my
Renaissance.
head, I know who you're talking about,
Okay,
but I don't know
right.
his name.
All right. But so a lot of Rosalind Drexler's stuff, it makes me think that she was well informed by what she was doing. But you can see, you know, it's these accessible, very simplified, accessible images. And then Ushio Shinohara is one of these artists that I think is, I don't know if I could handle being inside of his brain for a day, because this guy just thought, I mean, there are things that look like he was influenced by comic books and toys, and then he also just went crazy with it. You know, he took those influences and went crazy with it. The group that he was part of, yeah, it is pop art, but he belonged to another group that was called Neo-Dadaism. And that was kind of a lot of it is the Japanese, specifically Japanese take on pop art. And so we can see some of these same elements that Andy Warhol had, where you have very simplified portraits, and the colors are separated out, and there's no shading. So, and you can silkscreen it easier. And I just think it's really fascinating to see some of the stuff that he did. So definitely watch that video as well and look at those things. So we talked about some of the elements that are consistent with pop art, and that it does start. I mean, the pop and pop art does reference popular. And as with everything else, we see art movements swing one way and then swing another way. And we're not going to watch both of these. I just want to watch this one, which I think is a pretty good introduction to what op art is. And they're dealing with some similar style of graphic expression of imagery. And by graphic, again, I'm talking about like magazine layout kind of thing or poster art. And but it is a really interesting take on what the pop artists were doing. And this, I think, fits more into that postmodern element that we were talking about, where modernism deals 1850 to 1950. It deals a lot with using new media and new ways of visual expression, but they're still kind of dealing with meaning. And then we're fluxing into or morphing into postmodernism, which is a lot more interested in technique and material, and meaning and narrative aren't as important. So this is where we're going to start seeing, when we see a little bit of that emerging in pop art, but this is where we're going to really start seeing people, artists particularly, having fun with just building shapes and doing, making visual imagery on some level.
Op art is a style of art that developed in the 1960s, and it gets its name from optical. The artists were playing with the ideas of what happens inside your eye as you look at a piece of work. There's generally not going to be a subject with these pieces. You're not going to see rabbits or houses or landscapes, so they're not going to have a subject, but that doesn't mean that they're abstract expressionism. Op art, again, is very design-based. It's usually fairly simple, though some can be very complex as well. They play with this idea of colors contrasting. Victor Vasarely's piece called Exposition certainly does that. He takes a two-dimensional plane and makes you think it has 3 dimensions in it, as well as Bridget Riley's piece called Hesitate. These are only...
Now, Sarah, before we go on, what comes to mind? Why do you think this is called op art? And it says optical, but what is going on, do you think?
Well, I think they're exploring, because he talked about they're wanting to pay attention to what's happening in your eye, and so playing with kind of those I think there's a lot of math that goes into it too, of just how does your eye interpret things just on a flat plane.
Yeah, exactly. They're dealing with issues of what your brain expects these shapes to do. Because the assumption is when we have these circles, our brains will make the assumption that these are circles. And when the circles turn into ovals and then almost lines and then ovals again and circles again, our brains interpret that as a change in the surface. Mm-hmm. And and it's interesting because these artists did that a lot with both shape and color.
Only circles that are repeating themselves and changing their size, but we get this illusion of space happening. It's an optical illusion because it is just a 2-dimensional plane, but she's making it look 3-dimensional. It's very simple in the way that they're approaching it. It's not super duper complex, but it is super precise. We might see them play around with these ideas of warm and cool colors or contrasting blacks and whites. In these pillars by Joseph Albers, we see him playing with this repetition of color to get the rods and cones in your eyes to kind of react differently to them. We feel something innately when we look at a piece of work like this. When it's large and filling your frame of vision, you're having some sort of reaction to the work, and that's what they found interesting. It wasn't so much how beautiful or pristine the work was, it was what the work did to us. this optical illusion they wanted us to feel. And op art could even be done in 3 dimensions. So we have Red Sphere by Julio Leparc. And these are pieces of plastic that are strung from the ceiling in a cluster that makes an almost perfect sphere. Light pours in from the center, and it's disrupted by these turning panels. And we get this wonderful illusion, this sense of space that's coming off, and even the reflections are an important part of the work. So op art is playing with the ideas of optics to give us some sort of a feeling or affect us as we look at the work. And it doesn't have a subject, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's abstract expressionism.
So again, some of these artists, I'm just going to look at, I'm just going to show you the articles that I have associated with them. I would really like you, everybody watching this, to watch those videos. And so these are some examples of op art right here. Alexander Draculek, you know, this kind of optical illusion stuff where these feel like they are pyramids almost, and all it is just square spirals. Bridget Riley started off, I mean, some of her stuff kind of reminds me of Mary Cassatt and Van Gogh. And then as she's moving closer and closer to the 60s, she's dealing a lot more with ideas of eyes and what visual expectations our brains have. And then she starts doing this stuff where this band is white all the way across here, but when it gets right here, it looks like it's gray. Or different things like this, where it looks like there's this really deep canyon right here, because our brains assume that these squares remain squares all the way across. That the dots that we saw. This is really kind of fascinating. There was a study done with turntables way back in the 1930s, where a person was able, scientists were able to turn turntables at different speeds. And I remember we had the book when I was growing up, and I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember turntables, but you could put these discs on it that just had black and white markings. And if you turn them at different speeds, your eyes would see different colors. And Bridget Riley plays a lot with that too. And sometimes she does put colors in. Some of this does have colors. But what's interesting is that it's subtle enough that you don't know if it's an artifact of the computer screen or if it's your eyes are playing tricks with you. And I kind of like that, playing with the uncertainty. And this is just this is a color study where our brains will do different things, accepting an illusion of depth. Like some of these colors we assume are farther away, our brains do, and some of them are closer. And I just think it's really fascinating. And then he mentioned Victor Vasarely. And this person has done a lot of stuff that you still see. A lot of these things resonate today. And you can see people playing with these ideas. This is very similar to what Bridget was doing. You know, they're dealing with some of the same issues. And I think the biggest difference is that where Bridget had a lot of circles, this artist may only have a couple right in the center, and then our brains fill in the rest of the gaps. But this is, you know, his kind of thing where he plays with color and stuff. And if you look at this too long, or if you look at this long enough, after a while, if you're just staring right here, you're going to start seeing a wave happening around here, and you're going to think it's animated. And I think it's absolutely fascinating to see what kind of things are going on in your brain when you see these. And then one of my favorites is somebody that I just came across relatively recently, named Mavis Pusey, and her work is really fascinating because, and I like winding up with this artist because although Mavis is considered an op artist, what's fascinating to me is that she's dealing with expectations of that our brains have on shapes that are not necessarily limited to just the most simple shapes. And she deals with things that our brains start interpreting as wood grains and other materials. And I what comes in front, what goes behind, and just different really interesting things. And I really enjoy her stuff. It makes me think of Yoan Moreau and some of the earlier surrealists of 20 or 30 years before. And she's using material expectations that people had with pop art, even though this looks like it's silkscreen, for example, because the colors are so even and precise. This is actually oil. And I love the fact that she plays with your expectations. So definitely this is a little bit about her, and then there's also this video to watch about her. So very definitely explore what she does. So what are some of the consistencies that we see in the op art?
I think just that idea of like what like again it's like questioning. I feel like that's like a theme that we see all throughout the 20th century of just like questioning what art is. And now they're like looking at like these just flat planes on canvas or whatever it's on. And just being like these are actually just odd like just flat two-dimensional objects. And so like what does that mean and what like how can I manipulate those to like register as something else in somebody's brain?
Yeah, I think that's really good because they're dealing directly with our expectations about perception. And if we want to go meta, I think both pop art and op art are dealing with some of the same issues where on some level they're inviting the viewer to be introspective, introspective about our own personal expectations of culture, how we live, what we how the world is, how responsible are we for the information we're getting, how responsible are people for putting information out, all those kinds of things. I think that is subtly going on, just because of the kind of art that we're seeing for this specific time period. Now we're gonna. I'm sorry I babbled a bit, and we're gonna go through these ones a little bit faster, and I want to make sure that you guys do look at this. This is abstraction through a 1960s lens. We're moving away from abstract expressionism that we saw in like Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock. And what we are moving towards is an abstraction where people are moving away with any real need to connect with the world, other observable world, other than with colors and textures. And so Frank Stella is really fascinating. This person will actually, he's still working with narratives, but he's working with narratives and he's exploring with shapes that don't necessarily have anything to do with the narrative. He did a really incredible series called Moby Dick, where he went through and did these large lithographs for each chapter of Melville's book, Moby Dick, but it's all done with non-objective abstraction. And I think it's absolutely fascinating where he's kind of fusing these ideas we've been talking about, where people are moving away from content and narrative and more towards material exploration. That's what Frank Stella did, but he still invites you to make a connection somehow anyway. And Ava Hess is one of my very favorite. She does a lot of stuff where she takes ideas that have to do with cocooning and rebirth and regrowth, but not dealing with those directly necessarily, but kind of suggesting it sideways by using colors and texture rather than objects that you would recognize. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. So definitely take a look at her stuff. And then Jillian Ayers is, I really enjoy seeing her stuff because it feels to me like it does tie in quite a bit with what Jackson Pollock and some of his contemporaries and buddies were doing. And it's interesting to me that she came a little bit later. And I think that you can see some of that playing with drips and stuff like that Jackson Pollock did. I'm seeing a little bit of Helen Frankenthaler's influence, which, you know, and these are people that she knew and worked with quite a bit. But it's fascinating to me because she's also doing stuff that makes me think of, on one end, I'm seeing a little bit of some stuff that I would recognize from, that one painter had synesthesia. Oh, is it? I'm sorry. The name completely eluded me. Wassily Kandinsky. That's it. It looks to me. What's that?
No, that's what I thought. That's what I thought you were talking about. But I'm like, what?
Yeah,
What is
exactly.
synesthesia?
Yeah, it makes me think of Wassily Kandinsky. As Wassily Kandinsky could hear colors and see music, and this makes me think of some of that. But these shapes and bright colors also make me think of pop art. You know, just that same kind of. It feels like a bowl of jelly beans or something. You know, it has that kind of accessibility to me, even though it is very abstracted. And our work has so much energy. I just really enjoy seeing her stuff, but I kind of put that in there because it is not what anybody would expect. But it is, I think that this would exist, you know, some of these things could only exist as abstraction in the 1960s because these kind of colors and shapes, I think, are heavily informed by everything that came before. And that's the kind of idea that I want people to reflect on, that even though people will revisit earlier works and earlier ideas, they do it from the perspective of visual, auditory, or tactile vocabulary of the time they live in, which I think is really interesting. Now, when we talk about mid-century global architecture, what we're talking about is something that we still see a lot of remnants of today. And it is fascinating. It is dated, quite dated. And there are a couple of these videos that I want you to look at. But what's fascinating to me is that the dating is, I don't know, it's like that retrofuturism. It still feels kind of hopeful. And as you look at some of these imagery, some of this imagery, we're not going to watch the whole thing. Oh no, maybe we should. Do we have 4 minutes? No. Okay, I'll just speed through it. Now, some of these things you can see are very much heavily informed by the Bauhaus, and some of this, it looks very much like Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, he's called the Prairie style, and remember that the other big champions of the Prairie style were Green and Green in California, who did the bungalow and craftsman style take on it. But what's interesting is when you really jumble together things like the Bauhaus and Prairie style, then you start something, and Soviet constructivism or Russian constructivism, you start coming into something that develops, I think, organically in the mid-century modern. And I don't know, did you have a chance to see the St. George Parade of Homes, any of those homes?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Do you recognize this kind of architecture in some of those homes that they had?
Yeah, there was definitely one especially that I was like, holy heck, like this is just straight out of the, not necessarily the 60s, but I'm like maybe the 80s.
Yeah,
but definitely with those mid-century.
They have the same powerful lines and the same very simple geometry. But in my mind, I see a lot of influence from the Bauhaus, like in the shape of the chair, you know, that kind of a thing, where these different planes come to and where they kind of hang off. The floating stairs that you see in some of these high-end homes, that's a design element that comes right out of mid-century modern. this is where we see a lot of if you look at abandoned places on Instagram or YouTube, some of the really cool ones you see from China and Russia, the old Soviet Union, where that were built in a fury between 1950 and 1975, and they look like these futuristic UFO, flying saucer type buildings, or things that people thought the future would look like quite a bit. And I think it's amazing. But are you seeing what I'm seeing with those kinds of that line geometry and floating planes like you do in the Bauhaus?
Yeah. I think even like if you look at that little like console, it looks almost exactly like the outside of the Bauhaus building. So
Yeah, it's really fascinating. But it was a way of looking at functionality so it's pleasing. And one of the things that Frank Lloyd Wright really did that I think is so cool was in a lot of the homes that he built, he tried to latch onto the idea that even though you have to live in a home, it still shouldn't be completely separate from the world. And so the rationale behind a lot of this geometry and the textures and materials used were not just to explore what manufacturing processes could build, like in the Russian constructivism, but it was also to bring in elements from the outside. So that is why you would have leather, or you would have plastic that's designed to look like leather. You'd have these wood or wood laminate tables. It wasn't, the wood and wood laminate was not designed just to be something cool. It was designed specifically to bring the outside world into your home, so you could feel some sort of more of a connection with nature. You see this kind of curved laminate going on. A lot of that, I see a lot of that coming right out of Bauhaus Design School. And then, some of these textiles that are used are heavily influenced by op art. So and I think it's beautiful to see this all together. And then we see this is a speculation home for something that's built right next to a swimming pool. And I think a couple of the homes at St. George Parade of Homes did have viewing areas so you could look into the swimming pool. One of my favorite TV shows from this time period is, I'm dating myself, is, coolest was UFO, which you can find that those, you can find all of these on YouTube. But 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was a wonderful show. It was like Star Trek taking place under the ocean. And a lot of the set design was heavily influenced by this mid-century modern, because they felt that this was where the future was. And yeah, we can laugh about it now. Oh, this seems so dated. But would you say that feels pretty contemporary? Yeah, it's still profoundly, just like the Bauhaus still influences user interface and web design. Mid-century modern is still incredibly prevalent in stuff that's going on today. Now, we may not have these sharp angles like this. A lot of the angles are a lot more toned down, but we still have a lot of the same sensibilities. And I think like this table, you can get something that looks almost exactly like it at any IKEA you go to, and most Walmarts. It's still there. So I think that's really fascinating. And then I also mentioned brutalism. And I think I'm going to share this with you. We're not going to watch this whole thing. And as soon as the ad is over, I'm going to do the same thing. We'll kind of go through and talk about. Oh, sigh. Okay. Almost done. This is the drawback of not making you buy a textbook. Now, brutalist architecture, I used to not like it at all. And I still sometimes have a hard time with it. But when you look at the actual architecture itself, what we see is very clean and pure lines, but it seems to be, to me, a celebration of the material itself without a lot of the quaint affectations we put on to make something quote unquote livable. And the reason I say that, you look at a building like this, I don't know if have you ever seen the original Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Mm-mm.
That was filmed in, if anybody wants to get extra credit, watch that movie and then do, a 300-word or 3-minute artistic critique on it. And let me know, and then I'll make a little things that you can plug it in. But that was filmed in Mexico City, and what was so amazing, and Ultraviolet is another film that's similar. It was filmed in Shanghai, but they used this brutalist architecture structures to film it, and so you would do these concrete slabs where they are stretching what the concrete can actually do. This is actually entrance to one of the Arctic seed banks, where seeds are from all around the world are brought and stored in case there's any sort of disease problem or issue with killing off crops and stuff like that. This is what this is. But what is fascinating about it is it looks to me like it is heavily informed by the Russian constructivism, where they're celebrating what the material can do, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of the gentler lines that Russian constructivism did. It doesn't feel to me like it's in that kind of hopeful retrofuturist kind of thing. This seems to be more like a Brave New World kind of futurism, where it's just a little bit more minded on the power of cement and power of glass, and less on kind of the softness that a lot of humanity seems to be engineered to appreciate. And so, we get these things that look like very futuristic type buildings. And this is this is part and parcel of that that global mid-century modern. It's within it. It's like a subset of it, with one of the differences being that it's not as interested in bringing in or connecting with the natural world. It's designed to be essentially a celebration of the material, cement, steel, things like glass, things like that. Frank Gehry has a lot to say about it. He doesn't particularly enjoy this kind of art, but for him, this would be a lot more acceptable because it feels like there's some life to it than something like this, where it is just designed specifically to be a parking structure or a block of flats. And that's, just celebrating the strength of the cement. And I do like this kind of brutalism. This feels to me like it's having a little bit more fun. It's not taking itself so sternly. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And so when you guys are going through this, definitely look at this. I have 3 different people that really kind of defined the mid-century modern and still inform how we do things today. Kenzo Tange is Japanese, I believe, and the stuff that he did, you can see that in a lot of the buildings that people still build today, where you have these beautiful sweeping lines. It feels to me like he was more influenced by the hopefulness that we saw in the Russian constructivism when he did his things. Some of this was featured in the Wherein, that movie. It was one of the love hotels that, I don't know if you remember that movie at all. Wherein was attacked, and then this is where he went to recover. His friend took him there. But what Tange was doing is bringing these ideas to a really large scale. And yeah, some of these look more brutalist, but some of them look like he just had kind of a lot more fun. And like this, some of these remind me of the habitats you get for your gerbils. And his buildings just have this kind of Japanese playfulness to them that what's interesting is it still informs even anime today. I mean, it informs architecture in Southeast Asia, it informs anime, all sorts of things, but he's taking these kinds of ideas and making these beautiful structures that nobody'd ever seen before. And it feels rather sci-fi, I think. And then Lina Bobardi did the same kind of thing in Brazil. And I think that you can see, again, you see a lot of that influence of Bauhaus and, you know, different things like that, where we have these very strong geometric planes and geometric shapes that are designed to be universal, not exclusive. And then she also celebrates the structure of the components and the materials. And this is people talking about what she does, blah, blah, blah. And then here's another building. I just think that this is fantastic because, you know, you expect this to be on pillars, but it doesn't have to be. Lina Bobardi was good enough. She knew the structural strengths and tensile strengths of all the materials she worked with. So she designed it so it doesn't have any pillars underneath. It's a huge open space, and all of it is carried, all the weight is carried by these side structures. And she's celebrating this kind of the use of the material, but this material is also designed very much to feel like it has relationships to the natural world. I mean, you don't get ordinary cement looking like that unless you manipulate it to look like that. And so that, you know, this is the kind of stuff that she did that is really fascinating, and it still informs what people are doing today. You know, and then she has these playful shapes like this as well. In addition, like this feels a lot more brutalist to me. This feels kind of brutalist, but with a sense of humor. And then you have these kinds of forms holding it back and forth. Just some really cool stuff that she works with. Now, does this make you think of anything today? That interior space? This is still the exposed ducting and exposed drop lighting and things like that are things that people still feel are really contemporary. You know, and she designed this well before either of us were born. You know, she well, maybe not for me, well before you were born at least. But I mean, just really and lots of really fascinating stuff that she designed. And then Denise Scott Brown is not something that everybody knows so much because she and her partner did a lot of work together. And I'm trying to find, this one talks about what her stuff was that she did. And then this, the Architectural Digest article, I want you to look at that because this shows 6 of the buildings that she designed. And some of these are really very interesting. And it does seem to be heavily informed by those ideas of Russian constructivism and brutalism, but softened quite a bit. And the lines and the shapes that she uses to soften these buildings make me feel or remind me very much of Bauhaus influence and a little bit of Jugendstil too. But you know, without these windows right here and this kind of the way it's not formally balanced. It's this called informal balance, where we have the same number of panels. We have 5 on each side, but these are in a line, and this is one small one, and then 4 put together. So it's very balanced, but just a little bit different. And I think that's kind of fun. Then you have the chimney offset. This one I think is really interesting. This was a designed addition to London Gallery, and it feels to me very much like an Enlightenment era structure, which is when a lot of the information, a lot of the architecture in this National Gallery was informed by neoclassicism and Enlightenment era architecture, and they added on to it, and their job was to make it look like it belonged to the building. And it is interesting how they resolve some of these issues of support, where they didn't have to put a lot of pillars underneath to support the weight, but just like Lina Bobardi, they support it with these exterior columns right here. I think that's really interesting. And some of these just look like they had a lot of fun, but this feels very much like it's heavily informed by pop art to me. And this is one of their buildings as well. And this one, I think, is a really good example of that mid-century modern, a very strong example, where you have that kind of Bauhaus geometry, where you have some other things going on that kind of bring it a little bit closer to today's date, I think. And then instead of red, yellow, and blue coloring, we have something that feels a little bit more russet, and it just happens to match the color of the dead grass, which I doubt was. And then this, I think she's fusing those expectations of mid-century modern with very much a pop art feel, where you have all the kayaks and canoes on there. And I just think that's kind of a fun thing. But really, and I wanted to show you kind of everybody in the class, kind of a spectrum of what these different people were doing, because it wasn't all the same building that people were repeating. And it's not always, how can I say this? It's not always going to be the exact same checklist, for each participant in a movement. What kind of helps to define the participants in a movement is, I think, what the paintings or architecture, what those kinds of things give us as impressions, how they make us feel. I think that's a pretty good indicator of the movement. Another one might be not so much, but sometimes media and the way the media is used, or the media are used, subject matter, some of those things. And I think we can get kind of a pretty good sense. Now, I did go over a little bit. Do you have any questions or observations about any of the stuff that we looked at?
No.
Okay. Well, everybody watch all the videos, look at all those articles, and just do the best you can. I am so happy that Sarah joined me tonight, because I had to do this early. I'm not going to be able to access the internet tomorrow night, and I will have the last two modules up and revamped by the end of this week for you guys. If you have any questions, make sure that you go through and do the process for your proposal for the Capstone project, and go through and get everything you've done turned in. Because I'd be willing to bet you're going to realize as you go through the stuff you've done that there's a lot of stuff you haven't turned in yet. And just make sure you get it turned in so you get those points. And remember, everything is, you can resubmit everything up until the very bitter end of our class. All right. All right. Thank you, Sarah. And I hope you have a great week and weekend. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. You too.
All right. We'll see you.
Okay, see ya.